Hello, Puvan. Thank you for having me.
You have helped brands avoid having their reputations trashed by suppliers with poor performance on workers' rights. You have three statements to make, and I have three challenges for you. What's your first statement?
I believe that to tackle modern slavery and human rights abuses at raw commodity level, I think that brands and retailers need to take an industry-wide approach and collaborate to achieve transparency and accountability at every level of the value chain.
But the challenge is that most brands and retailers don't buy raw commodity materials directly. If you take an industry wide approach, does that mean defaulting to the standards of the worst member in the group? Is that likely to happen?
Well, it's been accomplished in conflict minerals. So the Responsible Minerals Initiative now has over 400 members. They have a very extensive due diligence process to audit or assess the refiners and smelters that they're implementing due diligence. And so I think that those middle chain actors are not going to respond to just one company. Even if it's one of the largest retailers in the world, like an Amazon or a Walmart, you need all the companies really saying, we need to implement due diligence throughout the entire industry.
But minerals are high value commodities, and specific legislation exists for conflict minerals. But the import and export of that commodity can be more easily traced than, let's say, palm oil, which can be intermixed and transshipped. So the origin is questionable. How would you compare these two industries?
I think that there is legislation. You have European legislation coming down the pike for mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. You have a number of legislation, anti-slavery or modern slavery legislation. So we are seeing that need to implement due diligence. So I do think that there's growing pressure on companies to understand where their raw materials exist and how to ensure that they're not contributing to real horrible harm. You also have the US withhold release orders that don't allow the importation of goods that are made with forced labor. So, and the mixing of palm oil is not that different than the mixing of tin or tantalum, right? The conflict minerals or gold, they all get melted together. And so you could lose traceability there as well. We're looking at cotton and all cotton from different countries could all be blended together, and it's very difficult to trace it at that point, which is why it's needed to implement due diligence at each tier of the value chain.
So you think that 10 years ago these initiatives were voluntary, but it's now harder to hide. In 10 years from now, it's going to be mandatory?
Definitely. And there's a lot more technologies coming online to trace product through DNA testing, isotope testing. There's more blockchain solutions to trace documentation electronically. So I think it's a combination that technology is improving and legislation is becoming more onerous on the brands and retailers.
What's your second statement?
I believe that brands and retailers need to take a due diligence approach, cascading due diligence expectations and requirements throughout the value chain, which will lead to impact. Due diligence requires implementing risk prevention and mitigation plans, coordinated with local stakeholders, which is what is needed to actually eliminate the human rights abuses embedded in our everyday goods.
I agree. But what if a brand discovers that sub-suppliers below tier 1 are unknown and so potentially significant risks? Should they stop sourcing from that chain?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And brands don't buy raw commodities, so there needs to be the expectation that the tier 1 is also implementing a due diligence approach, that they have requirements for their suppliers and that they have the management systems in place to be able to trace the product, the inputs, and to know that those inputs are not causing harm. In some instances, I have a lot of experience in the apparel industry, is that the brands are actually choosing the fabric, right? And then even though tier one, which is sewing the clothes together, is doing their activity, their manufacturing activity, they actually use the fabric that the brand chooses. So the brand knows at least the fabric manufacturer. They may not know the yarn manufacturer or who's processing the cotton, ginning the cotton. And that's why, again, I go back to this kind of industry-wide approach so that we could work with the various tiers. If the supplier at tier one, if the tier one is buying and choosing the raw materials, I think the expectations need to be there. You give them a chance to work towards it. If they don't want to cooperate and they're not interested in implementing any type of due diligence approach, I think you eventually disengage. I mean, we live by the OECD due diligence framework, which is seize, prevent, mitigate. You have to work towards preventing and mitigating. And if you don't, then you seize or you disengage from those supplier relationships.
But how can you compel people to do the right thing if they choose not to? We rely on a chain of information to establish trust. For an industry-wide approach to work, the obligations must cascade through the supply chain. And all this costs a lot of money. Typically, companies will use a snapshot social audit to claim that everything is okay to their customers and shareholders, and then a social media meltdown, which proves that things are certainly not okay. So are these companies and their auditors just cheating the system?
I think we need to empower and really embrace or kind of enable the middle of the supply chain. And I don't know if that's actually my next question, but there needs to be value for every tier. And if those suppliers see that there's value for them, that they have more access to markets, or that they could lose market for not doing it, they'll be motivated to do it. Training is expensive. If you're out there trying to do out in the field to do training, and typically the brands and retailers have not been as interested in funding training as they've been to funding audits. But I actually think that they should be funding training and capacity building first, because if people know what the expectations are, know what they're supposed to be doing, and motivated to do it, then there's going to be less of a need to kind of come down on the hammer with them, right? And do all those audits. And then we know that sometimes the audits are falsified, or they're not even very good audits. So I think if you take more of a approach toward improvement, continuous improvement type, where the suppliers have time to implement their own due diligence process, that's the way that we could make progress. It might be a little slower than we want, but I think it'll be longer lasting.
What's your final statement?
Any industry-wide approach should be focused on enabling, empowering the actors in the upstream section of the value chain to identify and address risk, instead of an approach that will just punish them. They need to understand the value and be motivated to address the harm.
The actors that we should empower, are they not either slavers or victims? If an auditor discovers that a company has broken the law, even if it is outside of the scope of the audit, should that auditor call the police?
So I think some of it depends on what type of forced labor it is and where does it exist, right? If you're talking in mines or in fields, it's very difficult to get close to where that's all happening. It is this cascading due diligence approach. And so even the upstream tiers of the value chain, the smelters, the spinners, even ginners or other, processors of palm oil or other commodities may not even know where the abuse is happening or what the drivers are of it. Is it state imposed? Is it generational debt bondage? So that's why creating risk mitigation plans and working with local stakeholders to create those plans is something that I think is really needed to address the risk more than just even traceability and knowing where your product comes from, but it's actually trying to address the harm.
So in trying to measure the S, we cannot just trace the product. We must include the people. We cannot put an S measure on a product unless we have that conversation with all the parties, knowing why they are at the table, with informed consent, and having the necessary information about living wages, livelihoods, children being in school. And this information is rarely presented in a product specification. But it must be part and parcel of what a buyer gets in order to be useful.
Of course. No, I think you articulated it very well. You know, you're going to have happy local communities, you're going to have more motivated workers, and that's all going to contribute to having higher quality goods, on-time deliveries, all of that. So I do think they're all interrelated and all need to be addressed together.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Thanks for the 10 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Puvan.
Bye.
Bye-bye.